Information that we have leads us to believe that the person that the Russians sought is in German custody, not U.S. custody. We'll have to wait for confirmation on that.
Right.
One thing that is interesting about the Evan Gershkovich part of this, former President Trump has been saying, without any provocation, without any underlying justification that anyone can find out, oh, if I'm elected, I'll get Evan out. Well, guess what? That's now off the table. Whether that was politically relevant or not to voters in this country, we don't know. But for reasons known only to former President Trump, he was hyping this. Well, that hype factory has now been silenced.
Yeah, and to Christine's point, now Biden puts this on his legacy as he is on his way out of office.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll be hearing from him shortly as well.
Yeah, all right. We'll be right back, but now is the time to check your local weather.
And we have been following breaking news. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was imprisoned in Russia, facing 16 years on espionage charges, now on his way home. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department consistently said the charges were false. His release is part of a complicated prisoner swap between the United States, Russia, and other countries. Now, we are still awaiting details as to what the U.S. negotiated with Russia. We do know it's a prisoner swap, but who these prisoners are, we're still awaiting confirmation of those details. It's believed that Gershkovich, as well as Paul Whelan, another American who has been held in Russia for years, will be in U.S. custody soon. Now, obviously, this is a tremendous relief for the families who have been waiting. They have been afraid of the possibility of their loved ones spending as many as 16 years in a Russian prison. We do know that U.S. officials have been working for weeks, months, years to negotiate some kind of prisoner exchange. Vladimir Putin and the Russian officials have said that regarding Evan Gershkovich, they wouldn't make that deal until Gershkovich's trial and conviction, which just happened recently. Again, he was facing 16 years behind bars. Now, from the beginning, the U.S. government has said that Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, committed no crimes. These were sham trials. They were not committing espionage. Ultimately, what they've been saying is that Vladimir Putin has been using Americans as bargaining chips to try and get his allies, prisoners that are held in America, released from custody. So again, we're waiting details as to what exactly the deal was. But this is a tremendous relief, not just for the families of the Americans who are being released, but also for Americans in general, that these Americans are coming home safe, they're coming home soon, and they are not going to be spending the next 15, 16 years in a Russian prison. So we are continuing to await some more details on this. Again, all developing here in the last few hours. We want to give a little context here, because it was not that long ago that we were here again with Brittany Griner, who was also held, an American held by Russia. And there was a deal made for a Russian arms dealer, Victor Bout. This is in late 2022 that this took place. And when that happened, there was a lot of talk about whether Paul Whelan, who has been waiting for more than 5 years in a Russian prison, would be part of that release. U.S. officials said at that time that Russia took him off the table. They said they would not release him at this time. And the Whelan family has expressed a lot of concern that the American government has forgotten about him, that there was so much talk about Brittany Griner, that there was so much talk about Evan Gershkovich, that Paul Whelan, a former Marine, has been forgotten about. But now, after 5.5 years, we are getting word that he may be home very soon. So again, a lot of significant developments. We also have to understand that while this is a great day for the families, Vladimir Putin certainly most likely got what he wanted out of this as well, continuing to use American lives as bargaining chips. And U.S. Russia relations right now at the lowest point since the Cold War, a lot of problematic situations rising between the U.S. and Russia. But this is a sign that on occasion the U.S. and Russia can negotiate a deal. Again, we're awaiting exactly who the prisoners released are. Brittany Griner was among those released. I also want to talk about Trevor Reed. Back in 2022, a Marine veteran, also held by Russia. Again, we have been here before, time and time again, where Russia has been able to successfully negotiate with the U.S. for release of Russian prisoners in exchange for American lives. And there's a lot of debate over whether the U.S. taking this action is harmful and encourages this kind of behavior. Right now, we want to go to Nancy Cordes, the White House correspondent. She joins me right now. Nancy, what do we know about the process of getting these Americans home right now?
Morning, Michael. So what we are told right now, and obviously this is a very sensitive situation that is still underway, we're told that the parties have agreed to a prisoner transfer and that they are expected to soon be in U.S. custody. One of the challenges whenever you have a prisoner swap like this is where do you actually do it? Where does the swap take place? Particularly if we're talking about prisoners not just from the U.S. and Russia, but potentially prisoners from other countries as well. We know that when Brittany Griner was released last year, the transfer took place on a tarmac in Abu Dhabi, and so we are waiting to see where the swap will take place this time around. We have gotten some more details as well, Michael. We're told that the 3 Americans who will be coming home are Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, Marine veteran Paul Whelan, and also a Russian-American radio journalist named Alsu Kurmasheva, who was taken into custody last year. We did start to notice that that prisoners were being moved out of both U.S. prisons and Russian prisons yesterday. And so that was an indication that something was afoot. And obviously, talks have been taking place on and off for months in the case of Gershkovich, years in the case of Paul Whelan. So we're waiting to see who they're going to be swapped for and what it was that led to the breakthrough that we appear to be seeing today.
Yeah, Nancy, I wanted to ask about that. Do we have any indication right now of who the U.S. is giving up? Who is Russia getting in exchange for these Americans?
That is still unclear, and that has obviously always been a sticking point and a source of controversy. There are some U.S. officials and politicians who say that the U.S. should not be releasing any Russians who we have in custody here or who our allies might have in custody around the world in order to get an American back. These are, people we view as bad guys for a reason, who we think have done bad things. That's why they are in custody. But the Biden White House has taken a pretty pragmatic view on this, which is that if there are Americans who are wrongfully detained anywhere in the world, they are going to do what they have to do to bring them home. So there are a number of questions still to be answered. Who is being released? Are they being released here in the U.S. or are they being released in other countries? There is one Russian in particular who's been held in Germany, suspected spy, also accused of murder, who the Russians have been trying to get home as part of some prisoner swap for quite some time. So would that individual be involved? Maybe Russians who are detained in other countries around the world. How many suspected Russian spies are being released in exchange for these very high-profile Americans who have been, who've been sought by the U.S. for quite some time now?
You know, Nancy, former President Trump has said that he would be able to negotiate Evan Gershkovich's release immediately if he won the White House. Now that this has happened under the Biden administration, or now that this process is taking place, how significant is this for the Biden administration that this is happening?
It's very significant. This is something that President Biden has described as priority number one for him for quite some time. Obviously, there was a ton of relief and fanfare when Brittany Griner was released last year. That was also a big goal of his. He routinely meets with the family members of these hostages. There is a big team at the State Department, which is solely involved in trying to get these individuals home. So this is a big priority for this administration, not just when it comes to Americans who are held in Russia, but also Americans who were held in Venezuela, who were also brought home. President Biden has really made the case since the beginning of his administration that if there are Americans who are wrongfully detained anywhere in the world, he's going to do everything he can to bring them home.
I want to talk about Paul Whelan also, because I remember it was just last month. It was just a July 4th when the Whelan family was talking about him spending another Independence Day in Russian custody. And the family at times trying to put pressure on the administration and the government, feeling at times that he'd been forgotten. Have we seen pressure from the family on the White House, on the government, trying to get his name out there, get more attention on that case?
Yeah, you know, you can only imagine the agony of this family as they watch other Americans several times now be released by the Russians without Whelan coming home. Sometimes that's out of the U.S.'s control. Russia's only going to release who it wants to release. And there are a variety of reasons why the Russians might be willing to release one individual and not others. But there's no question that he has sort of been passed over multiple times now. He's been held since 2018. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison for espionage, something that the U.S. has always denied that he was involved in. He was in Russia to attend a friend's wedding. And so, you know, his imprisonment in particular is something that has weighed on this president and that this president has talked about quite a bit. And so, you know, you can imagine that, you know, as part of these talks, obviously Evan Gershkovich has gotten a lot of attention because he is a Wall Street Journal reporter. He was simply doing his job, you know, when he was taken into custody. So he's quite high profile, just as Brittany Griner was. But it was always an insistence of this administration in talks with the Russians that any prisoner swap would have to involve Whelan as well.
Nancy, there are going to be those that argue that deals like this will only encourage Vladimir Putin to continue to take Americans into custody on false charges. Have you heard some of that talk in the White House?
We've certainly heard it on Capitol Hill, and I'm sure we'll hear it again today. There are politicians, and you'll probably hear it more from Republicans, who will argue that the U.S. is appeasing Russia by releasing Russians in exchange for Americans who have done nothing wrong. They will argue that that any time the U.S. does this, that it simply makes Americans abroad less safe, that it inspires bad actors, whether it is Vladimir Putin or some other dictator or even a private actor simply looking for a big payday, that it fuels them to take Americans hostage, knowing that either American companies or the American government will be willing to pay a big price to get them out. This is a trade-off that this White House and the State Department have really grappled with, because that is, you know, that is an obvious concern. President Biden has come down on the side of it's worth it to take those risks because it's so important to bring Americans home. But no question, there will be politicians who argue the opposing view, which is that that doing this just makes more Americans less safe.
Now, remind us, what did Russia claim that Gershkovich and Whelan did? What was the crime that they were accused of committing and convicted of?
So they were both taken into custody and accused of espionage, and later they were sentenced to 16 years for espionage. Obviously, in the case of Gershkovich, you know, he's really guilty of being a good reporter. He was in Russia covering Russia. That's all that he was doing there. In the case of Whelan, you know, there's never been any evidence that he was conducting any espionage. These are simply Americans who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And this is something that we have seen time and time again. So it's a pretty old storyline. There's also this Russian-American radio journalist, a journalist for Radio Free Europe. Her name is Alsu Kurmasheva, and she was similarly accused of something like trying to incite Russian troops or to report falsely on Russian troops. Obviously, she was simply there in her capacity as a journalist as well. And we're now told that she is involved in the deal along with others. So it appears to be more a matter of convenience for the Russians about who they take into custody and when. They take individuals like Brittany Griner into custody because these are people who are relatively well known in the United States, and they believe that the U.S. will be willing to pay a higher price to get someone high profile like that back to U.S. soil.
Nancy, we can't separate the fact that we are less than 100 days out from an election. And despite the fact that President Biden is no longer in that race, how significant a win is this for the administration?
I think it's a major win for a president who has been pretty beaten down lately, frankly. I mean, he did not want to leave the race. He resisted it for weeks, even as members of his own party argued that he should go, that he had lost a step. He made the case over and over again that he was able to do the job, that he had gotten a lot done in his first term, and that he was prepared to get a lot done in his second term. But nevertheless, the heat just got too intense. You had members of congressional leadership from the Democratic Party basically signaling to him more and more publicly that he needed to leave the race and hand the reins over to his vice president. And that was, as you can imagine, something very difficult for this 81-year-old president who had spent decades trying to attain this position and finally had. It was not easy for him to step aside. And so there's no question that a breakthrough like this that had been sought in Paul Whelan's case for years, but in Gershkovich's case about a year, there's no question that this will be a much desired change of storyline for the president, who has really kind of laid low since handing the reins over to Harris about a week and a half ago. She is obviously now the star attraction as she crisscrosses the country running for president. And I assume that once the transfer has actually taken place and these individuals are on their way back to U.S. soil, that he will want to come out and speak publicly and explain to the American public what went into this deal.
Have we seen much of Evan Gershkovich or Paul Whelan or Kermasheva? Do we know what condition they've been in the last time we saw them? I know we saw Evan Gershkovich at his sentencing a few weeks ago.
Right. They've been in various jails. They've been in penal colonies. We only see them when they have a court appearance, and Paul Whelan doesn't really have court appearances anymore because he was sentenced so long ago. So he is off. They're all in touch with U.S. officials on a regular basis, but the one we've seen the most, obviously, is Gershkovich, because he's the one who has had the court appearances over the past year. And he has a very interesting approach to these court appearances. Anytime you see him, and he's usually behind bars or behind in sort of a glass box, and he's usually smiling and kind of joking and lighthearted, almost as if to send a message. I know this is a sham. I know that I haven't done anything wrong. And I know why the Russians are doing this. He's also been able to communicate with his family. He plays a long-distance chess game with his father via correspondence. So, and certainly we hear from his family, we hear from executives at the Wall Street Journal quite a bit as they look to keep his story alive and to make sure that his plight is not forgotten. But it will be truly amazing to see him back on U.S. soil and to hear directly from him what he was thinking when he was in those courtrooms, when he was hearing these charges being read against him, charges of espionage, and really how he maintained his optimism and his sanity while he was being held in, what by all accounts are pretty punishing conditions over the past year and a half.
Nancy, do we expect to hear from the president soon on this?
I anticipate that once there is a swap, Once the swap has actually happened, then we will hear from the President of the United States. That's how it typically works, that U.S. officials try to lay really low. They don't want to say anything that would jeopardize the transfer. And so they tend to say as little as possible. In fact, they tend to prefer that we don't even know about this before the swap has actually happened. Obviously, now the cat is out of the bag, but they tend to prefer to say as little as possible until we know that the swap has taken place and we know that those Americans are on their way back here to the U.S.
Well, Nancy Cordes at the White House, thank you for keeping us up to date. I know you're working to get more details on this, so we will check back with you shortly. So again, to recap for our viewers just joining us, a pretty significant development. Americans who have been held hostage in Russia, prisoners for at times more than a year, in Paul Whelan's case, more than 5 years, released shortly. We do believe that a deal for a prisoner swap has been made between the U.S. and Russia. Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kurmasheva, all expected to be released. We're still awaiting details as to what America agreed to as part of this deal. But we should have more information coming in the next few minutes and hours. We are working hard to get that information. So we're going to take a short break, but we will come back a little later with some more details on this developing story.
On our places, bright shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing and bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else. This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
You can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
Okay, let's go. You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going.
The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
I'm a voracious consumer of information and news. I am constantly curious and constantly want to learn. I know I personally want to know the basic facts of every issue and to press into the heart of the matter. Information is the currency of democracy, and that's what we bring to the table every Sunday.
We are following some breaking news and some welcome news. 3 Americans held in Russia facing the possibility of years behind bars. Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, and Alsu Kurmasheva are now on their way home as part of a major prisoner swap with Russia. We are awaiting details, and we are now going to a CBS News special report.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Nate Burleson in New York with Major Garrett and Christine Johnson. Breaking news, the United States and Russia have agreed to a prisoner swap that will see the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and Marine veteran Paul Whelan. Gershkovich was recently sentenced to 16 years in prison on espionage charges. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department consistently said the charges were false. The United States said Whelan was also wrongfully detained. Nancy Cordes is at the White House with what we are learning. Nancy, good morning.
Good morning, Nate. Well, this is indeed a major breakthrough long sought by the Biden administration with many stops and starts. We are told that these individuals are soon to be in U.S. custody, both Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan. Paul Whelan has been held in Russia since 2018. He has been behind bars for 5.5 years, a former Marine who, for a variety of reasons, was passed over during multiple prisoner swaps. Other individuals were brought home. Now he is finally coming home. We're told there's a third American who is coming back to the U.S. as well. Her name is Alsu Kurmasheva. She is a Russian-American radio journalist who was taken into custody in Russia last year. She was accused of spreading false information about the Russian army. But U.S. officials have always argued that she was doing exactly what Evan Gershkovich was doing in Russia, which was reporting the news, just as journalists have done there for decades.
Nancy, thank you very much. Joining us now on the phone is John Sullivan, a former U.S. ambassador to Moscow. Good morning, John. It's great to have you with us. Your perspective not only on the gravity of this deal, but its complexity.
Well, good morning. It's great to be with you. It's a great day for those individuals who are being released and their families. It's been a long time, as Nancy noted. It's been almost 6 years of incarceration for Paul Whelan, and not only for the detainees, but their families, who suffer as much as the detainees do during their incarceration. But this comes at a cost. The Russians aren't releasing these people for nothing. There are Russian criminals who are being traded for the release of these innocent Americans. So there's another side to this story as well.
And John, what should we, if anything, conclude about the timing of this? We are in the middle, as you well know, of a very heated presidential campaign. All developments like this carry a political echo effect. What do you think is on the mind of the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, in this regard?
Well, I've thought about that. There are a number of different variables that can go into a release like this, having been involved in several of these transfers in the past. Certainly political calculations by the Kremlin, when to do it. There are other things we may not be aware of now. The health of a particular detainee, if that's deteriorating. So there are a lot of variables. Politics is certainly one of them.
Ambassador Christine Johnson here, talking to you from New York. Getting from the political now to the personal, talk us through how this exchange actually works.
So I've seen reporting from Russian media over the last several days that the American detainees have gone missing from their labor camps and prisons in Russia. And what that signaled to me was the Russians were moving them to Moscow, which is what's happened in the past. They moved them to a central location, the FSB. They're all put on a plane and then flown to the location that the Russians and we have agreed on for the exchange, which will occur as you know, you see in spy movies with 2 planes on a tarmac and the detainees walking between them.
John, thank you. Let's bring back in Nancy Cortez, who is standing by at the White House. Nancy, I want to ask you about President Biden and what do you believe his next move is going to be?
Well, typically in these situations, Nate, once the prisoner swap has taken place and the Americans are safely on their way to U.S. soil, then we will generally hear from the president himself. He will come out and make a statement and explain what has just transpired. Before then, it's generally radio silence. In fact, U.S. officials would probably, we rather not be talking about this at all. They would hope that no one would know about this until it happened. They certainly aren't going to say anything publicly because they always worry that there's something that they could say at the last minute that could jeopardize these very sensitive transfers.
Nancy Cortez and Ambassador Sullivan, thank you for standing by with this breaking news. Of course, our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, and there will be more tonight on CBS Evening News. Many of you will return now to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Nate Burleson with Major Garrett, Christine Johnson here in New York.
If you're just joining us, we've got breaking news. 3 Americans being held by Russia are now on their way home. Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, and Alsu Kurmasheva, part of a large prisoner swap with Russia. We are awaiting details on the specifics, what prisoners America was willing to release to Russia in exchange for these 3 Americans. We don't know yet, but we do know this has been in the works for months. Apparently, Gershkovich, Whelan, and Kurmasheva right now are on their way to U.S., hopefully in U.S. custody soon. I want to bring in Olivia Gaza, CBS News intelligence and national security reporter. Olivia joins us now. Olivia, are you with us right now? Can you tell us what you know, what you're hearing about how this is all taking place?
Sure, Michael. Officials who have been intimately involved in what you accurately described as a month-long negotiation have described it to me as one of the most complex in U.S. Russia history and even U.S. Soviet history, when we, of course, all know spy swaps hit a crescendo. The reason for that is the number of players involved and the number of now political prisoners involved. The U.S., of course, disputing that either Evan Gershkovich or Paul Whelan were involved in any kind of espionage, finding them both to have been wrongfully detained by the Russians. Alsu Kurmasheva, also a journalist, the U.S. did not officially designate her in the course of its investigation to be wrongfully detained, but President Biden personally appealed for her release in April of this year, calling her out by name and calling on the Russians to release her. Speculation had been mounting that a deal was close when people who monitor prisons in Russia noticed that some high-profile political prisoners had been shifting around, had disappeared from rosters. Among them was Paul Whelan and another prominent Kremlin critic, Vladimir Kara-Murza. We are still awaiting final details of what this negotiation involved, which prisoners might be going where, but we do expect that these 3 American citizens expect to step on U.S. soil in a matter of hours tonight.
And Olivia, remind us, what had Russia charged these Americans with? What were they accused of doing?
Sure. Well, Paul Whelan is the longest-held American in Russia. He was detained there in 2018 and accused essentially of espionage, things that his family disputes that he has vehemently disputed, that the State Department and U.S. government writ large has disputed. The same thing with Evan Gershkovich, who traveled to Russia on a reporting trip, was detained there in 2023, accused of espionage. And in both of these men's cases, convicted of these charges and sentenced to long sentences in Russian penal colonies. Paul Whelan, of course, serving out a number of years already, and Evan Gershkovich recently sentenced in July. Alsu Kurmasheva, in a similar sort of rushed trial earlier in July, was sentenced to 6.5 years. She was accused of spreading false information about the Russian military. The U.S. administration obviously views all of these as trumped-up charges and as Russia trying to negotiate for political prisoners, things that it's taken with caprice and without real cause.
These 3 Americans coming home, obviously a tremendous relief, not just for the families, but for all Americans. But did Vladimir Putin also get what he wanted, too, in terms of using American lives as bargaining chips to get prisoners released? Is this a win for him, too? Well, apart from a win for him, it's not without a cost to the U.S., right? We are still awaiting the details of who was swapped for whom. We do know it's been publicly reported that the Russians have had their eyes on a convicted murderer held in a German prison whose name is Vadim Krasikov. That had been their area of focus. They had repeatedly expressed interest in getting his release, but he was not in U.S. custody. He was in German custody. So that was obviously a snare in the early negotiations in this deal. We, again, still need to confirm who the Russians exactly are getting in exchange for these 3 high-profile Americans. The Biden administration has managed to secure over the past 3.5 years the release of more than 60 hostages and wrongful detainees, but very few of them have attained the level of prominence and gotten the following that these Russian cases have. I want to bring in Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News senior foreign correspondent. Elizabeth, you were in court for Paul Whelan's trial in Russia. What can you tell us about how that process played out?
It was back in the winter of 2018, and Paul Whelan looked blindsided. The circumstances of his arrest were very peculiar. He'd made friends online with some members of the Russian military. He's an ex-Marine, U.S. Marine. And eventually one of them had invited him to a wedding in Moscow. So he went, and as a wedding guest, he'd come down into the lobby of his hotel, and suddenly the FSB showed up and arrested him and said that he had a thumb drive in his pocket full of classified material. Now, we never saw evidence of that. His family says he never saw evidence of it either. And just as in Gershkovich's case, we were never allowed to stay in the courtroom past the first few minutes, which was kind of a photo op where we got to see Paul Whelan. He was standing in the dock, that prisoner's dock in the Russian style behind glass, and he just looked completely stunned. He couldn't believe it was happening. He then went away and spent almost 6 years in a Russian jail. So he has been the longest incarcerated, and I noticed looking at him, he has lost quite a lot of weight since those first few days, but he still looks pretty well, actually, considering what's happened in the meantime. His case was a little diplomatically difficult because although he'd been a U.S. service member, he also held a Canadian and Irish passport. And so there was some diplomatic shuffle trying to figure out which government needed to go to bat for him. And certainly the U.S. had the most power and influence, and in the end has really stepped up. And today his family will be ecstatic to think that he's finally on the way home.
Well, Elizabeth, it was just about 2 weeks ago that Evan Gershkovich was sentenced in Russia. What can you tell us about that process?
That may have been the very first inkling we had that a deal was being cooked up, because he should have been not tried yet. In other words, his original court date was later this month. And suddenly we got news that it had been moved ahead a full month at the request of his defense lawyers. And we know that the Russians had floated the idea of this prisoner swap, but had said categorically it couldn't take place until Gershkovich's trial was over. So the defense lawyers saying, all right, let's get it underway, was a signal that they needed a sentence in order to move on to freedom. Indeed, as soon as that sentence was delivered, it was very harsh, 16 years. There began to be a little bit of buzz around the fact that the talks were really going to come to fruition, and he too would be on his way home. His parents, I can't imagine how thrilled and relieved they are.
And we have focused on the 3 Americans, but there's also a prominent British citizen with U.S. ties being released. What can you tell us about him?
Vladimir Karamurza. He is a longtime dissident, incredibly brave. He's long worked on human rights issues and, in fact, earned the respect of John McCain, Senator McCain. And shortly before McCain's death, he asked in an email whether Karamurza would be one of the pallbearers. So if you look at the photographs of Senator McCain's funeral now, you'll see Vladimir Karamurza among the pallbearers, along with President Biden, incidentally. He then, even from jail, began to write, kept on writing very punchy and well-reasoned critiques of Putin's government and the gross human rights abuses that were continuing, and in fact won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for those writings. He believes he was poisoned twice by the FSB, maybe as a warning, but he survived both times. Though his health is thought to be very fragile. So it's of particular, I think, relief to his family that he's getting out of Russian custody, because he won't have been getting the medical care that he needed to, to thrive.
Elizabeth, at this point, do we have any sense of who the Russians could be getting in return?
Well, the only name is the one that Olivia mentioned, Vadim Krasikov. He's been at the top of the list for a long time, and that indicates that the Germans have agreed to be part of this swap because they're the ones who have him in custody. There's also some speculation in the Russian press that there will be a handful of Russian spies disguised as diplomats who've been arrested over the years, one in Norway, perhaps, another one somewhere in Europe, and they will be sent home as opposed to having to cool their heels in European jails. But their details on that are very scant at the moment. We're just going to have to wait and see.
I want to bring Olivia back in. A deal like this, a massive prisoner swap, can you talk about how many agencies, and this is not just multiple agencies in the U.S., but also multiple countries involved, how large is the scope of a deal like this?
Right. Well, I think we're still awaiting details on who exactly was involved, but we do know multiple government agencies, including the White House, the State Department, and the CIA, which has what's referred to as a special channel with the Russians in order to discuss swaps like these, just given the long-standing, again, history going back to Soviet times when spy swaps were much more frequent. This scenario is different. It is not a spy swap. This, again, appears to involve a number of political prisoners, which makes it more fraught because there's nothing to acknowledge in terms of wrongdoing. In fact, the U.S. has maintained that Alsu and Evan and Paul have been completely innocent in all of these cases. In Whelan's case, I want to highlight in particular, I mean, Liz just laid out exactly why this is so poignant for him. Also why? Because he was passed over effectively twice in prior negotiations that U.S. administrations engaged in. Trevor Reed was released in a swap for a Russian pilot in 2022. And then Brittany Griner, the WNBA star, was released in December of 2023 in exchange for a known Russian arms dealer, Victor Bout, all while Paul continued to be held in Russia. So the fact that he is being released today is also a result of pressure mounting on the administration. You cannot leave him behind once again. And in fact, U.S. officials have been speaking publicly to the fact that they are absolutely determined to bring both Paul and Evan home. Earlier this month, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said as much on stage at an Aspen conference where he said the U.S. and President Biden were determined to bring both of them home. He spoke elliptically about possibly a deadline at the end of this month, which raised some eyebrows in the audience. And the special hostage envoy, Roger Carstens, also spoke publicly about these efforts to free both men, in addition to Alsu in dealing with the Russians.
Well, Olivia, you bring up a good point, because I remember it was just last month, July 4th, the Whelan family said that Paul Whelan spending another Independence Day in Russian prison. How hard, we've talked about how hard the government has been working for this deal. How hard have the families been working? What have they had to do to try and keep their loved ones in the spotlight?
Absolutely. In Paul's case, it really has been a family effort, and Liz spoke to it as well. His brother has been working very hard to maintain contact with press outlets. They understand that keeping his name in the press keeps him relevant and keeps attention on his situation. They would always send updates when he underwent a transfer, when he was beaten in prison, which happened. He managed to, in recent weeks, secure a Russian cell phone and was managing to call members of the press and U.S. government officials, including the special hostage envoy, to provide an update on his case and hopefully get an update on where things stand for him. Of course, it's an open line. Russian officials are listening in the entire time, so you can't explain all of it. But he has been trying to reach out and personally make his case to U.S. government officials and press. His sister, Elizabeth, has consistently traveled to Washington in order to advocate for his release, again, getting in government officials' faces in order to say, you can't pass over Paul another time.
Elizabeth, I want to go back to you. As I understand it, you've spoken to the Whelan family. Can you tell us what you've heard?
His brother lives in Toronto, and he has been leading the charge, trying to keep Paul's case front and center. He was tireless, very much encouraged by the American embassy in Russia. While it was able to, the American ambassador kept visiting Whelan, even during the years of COVID, when I think to Paul Whelan, he must have felt that he was forgotten about. His brother was a very good correspondent, and he's eloquent in his emails. And I think he, more than anybody, managed to keep this case alive and will deserve a huge amount of the credit, and I'm sure Paul's gratitude when he finally gets to give him a great big hug.
It's a tremendous relief, I think, for all Americans. Olivia, I want to ask about the significance of this prisoner swap. We're talking about 24 prisoners. Now, we have cut deals with Russia before, the U.S. government. This is a pretty large-scale deal. Is this the largest in recent memory?
It is the most complex in recent memory. Officials who were involved in the negotiations described it to me as the most complex in U.S. Russia and even U.S. Soviet relations, precisely because of the number of players involved and the type of prisoners involved here. We talked about the agencies that are involved, the White House, the State Department, the CIA. All of them would have had discrete roles in dealing with the Russians in trying to secure these prisoners' release. And as you were talking with Ambassador Sullivan earlier, there is, of course, a cost that the U.S. always factors into these decisions that they make, right? They look closely as to whether the people that they may be releasing go back to a life of crime, whether they go back and pose a threat to the United States. And when the special hostage envoy was speaking earlier this month, he said in recent years that has not been the case. The calculus that the U.S. has made in order to make these exchanges has wound up being relatively safe in terms of U.S. interest. It has paid off in terms of getting Americans home and releasing, in some cases, the convicted criminals that they have released in order to secure Americans' freedom.
And right now we are joined on the phone by John Sullivan. He was U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022, and he is now a CBS News contributor. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us on the phone. First, I want to get your reaction to this prisoner swap, the release of these Americans.
Well, thanks. Good morning. It's great to be with you. This is literally a big deal. Lots of moving parts, different countries involved, complex not just for the U.S. government, all the different agencies that were mentioned, but different countries involved, which makes this really unusual. And the scale, the number of people who are being moved today, it is large, it is impactful, but it comes at a cost to the United States. The United States is releasing convicted Russian criminals, and as I understand it, there's an FSB colonel. The FSB is the principal successor to the KGB. who is in custody in Berlin serving a life sentence for murder, sent to commit a murder by the Russian government in Berlin. So there is a cost to the United States and to our allies, but the calculus that was made was that getting all of these people out, including someone like Paul Whelan, whom I consider a friend, he and his family, who's been detained for almost 6 years now. It's a great day for them and their families.
Well, Ambassador, I think anytime Americans come home safely, it's cause for celebration. But does this also give incentive to Vladimir Putin to do this again, to take Americans as bargaining chips to get more prisoners released in the future?
Of course it does. This does not signal a change in U.S. Russia relations. The way I would characterize it, the way I would think of it from Putin's perspective, Putin believes he's at war with the United States. He would treat this as basically an exchange of prisoners of war during wartime. There's no improvement in U.S. Russia relations. U.S. citizens in Moscow, in Russia, are at risk of being detained without cause and used by the Russian government for trades just like this.
Ambassador, if you can give us some context as to the state of U.S.-Russia relations. I've heard it said that we're at the lowest point since the Cold War. Do you think that's accurate?
No. If it's from the Cold War, this is the lowest point it's been in my lifetime, which predates the end of the Cold War. It's as bad as one could possibly imagine. I speak a lot about the war in Ukraine and U.S.-Russia relations, and particularly to an American audience, as I describe the situation, U.S.-Russia relations, the state of the war, I start off by saying, as bad as you think it is, it's even worse than you think.
Well, Ambassador, we're going to continue this conversation with us. Thanks for being here. But we're learning more details all the time about this massive prisoner swap that's going to lead to the release of Paul Whelan, Evan Gershkovich, Alsu Kurmasheva, 3 Americans held in Russia, now on their way home. We're going to take a short break, and we'll have more details for you coming up.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
That desired farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
All right, if you're just joining us, we're following breaking news. A major prisoner swap is underway between the U.S. and Russia. Americans Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan are among the list of prisoners to be freed. Also among them, American-Russian journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, also believed to be headed home. We have CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis with us. We also have the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan, on the phone. We're going to get to Mr. Sullivan in a bit, but Olivia, I want to start with you. If you can talk about who else is included in this swap.
Sure. I think we're still learning those details as they're being released. We do know that it is a constellation of prisoners that the Russians have held and that the U.S. has held. The 3 Americans who are coming home are being given to the Russians at a cost, right? We do know that the Russians were keenly interested in a convicted murderer held in a German prison known as Vadim Krasikov. He assassinated a Chechen, Georgian who fought against Russian troops in Chechnya and had been serving a life sentence in Germany. We understood the Russians to be keenly interested in him, but of course he wasn't in the U.S.'s custody. So we have to see whether that he was part of the final deal that finally got this over the finish line. We understand that it is one of the most complex deals, as officials who were involved in it described it to me, in U.S. Russian and even U.S. Soviet history, when again spy swaps were the norm. In 2014, there was a massive spy swap between the U.S. and Russia in which 10 Russians went back, and officials said this was even more complex than that one.
Olivia, these 3 Americans coming home certainly cause to celebrate, but there are other Americans still being held in Russia. What can you tell us about that?
That's right. It is important to note that this is a huge success. These 3 Americans had a lot of attention paid to their cases. In the cases of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, they were deemed wrongfully detained by the U.S. government. Alsu's case got personal attention from President Biden and was going through the State Department's deliberative process in terms of determining whether she was officially wrongfully detained. But there are still a number of Americans who are held in Russian prisoners, among them a teacher, Mark Fogel, whose family has also been very vocal in trying to get him released. There's a musician recently taken named Michael Travis Leak, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Gordon Black, recently imprisoned, and a Russian-American ballerina, Ksenia Karolina, who remains imprisoned. Their cases probably not as clear-cut. Again, the U.S. has a very specific deliberative process through which it determines whether these are actually political prisoners or whether, as Ambassador Sullivan was describing, they committed some minor infraction or even broke a Russian law and therefore received outsized punishments by the Russian government.
Olivia, what type of conversations had to have been taking place to involve so many agencies and so many countries?
Sure. Well, we know from past cases that the Russians don't like to deal with diplomats as much as they like to deal with intelligence officers. Very often, these cases are handled by the CIA, which has run point in the past for very sensitive negotiations, including Brittany Griner. And that's more the Russians' preference than the U.S. preference. I think the U.S. would have preferred to engage diplomatically in all of these cases so as not to lend credence to the idea that either Paul Whelan or Evan Gershkovich had in any way connections to the agency or to espionage or to any sort of activity of that kind. And that's why they would have preferred diplomatic channels. But the Russians often insist on keeping things quiet, on wheeling dealing, and on dealing with the CIA via their intelligence services in these kinds of discussions.
What can you tell us about the process where the U.S. government tries to determine when Russia accuses an American? How does the U.S. government respond to that and determine that somebody is actually a political prisoner?
Sure. It can be a lengthy process, and there are strict guidelines by which it is done. When an American is detained anywhere overseas, U.S. officials immediately request consular access to that person. They try to get a lawyer in the room. They try to get U.S. diplomats in the room to understand what exactly has come to pass, what the person may be charged with, or what the allegations are. From there, it's not a public process, but it is a deliberative process within the SPIHA, which is the Special Presidential Envoy's office, who will determine whether their cases actually violated a local law or whether this is, again, somebody taken capriciously by a foreign government and is being held as a political prisoner. There's no visibility into that process, but it has guidelines established by Congress that the U.S. uses in order to officially declare somebody wrongfully detained or not.
Well, Olivia, as we're having this conversation, we have live pictures of the plane landing in Turkey now, carrying these Americans home. What were Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, Alsu Kurmasheva, what were they facing if this deal didn't happen as far as a life in a prison in Russia?
What a moment. Let's just pause. I mean, the fact that we're getting pictures of an exchange in Turkey is absolutely historic. Obviously, a third country that everybody needed to agree on for this swap to take place. I got chills when you told me that it was actually happening. An incredible moment in which a very hard-fought negotiation appears to have succeeded. In all of these cases, Paul Whelan, again, was the longest-held American detainee in Russia, was in a penal colony, was beaten, had his things taken away, was abused, told these stories when he managed to get them out of the Russian penal colony where he was being held. He was sentenced to 16 years in that kind of a Russian prison for charges that, again, the U.S. has insisted were trumped up. His family has said are absolutely false, and he, of course, has maintained his innocence throughout. Evan Gershkovich, arrested during a reporting trip to Yekaterinburg in 2023, guilty of nothing more, as we have heard the slogans, than committing the act of journalism, which, of course, is not a crime. But he was sentenced in a very hasty trial in early July to also 16 years in a Russian penal colony. We saw the pictures of him in the Russian cell. We could not hear him, but we saw him at some points try to express optimism, holding up a heart symbol, smiling for the press. And we have routinely heard U.S. government officials who have met with them, diplomats on the ground in Russia, describe them as resilient, as strong, as really keeping up their spirits in the face of incredible adversity for years, and in Whelan's case, years and years.
And as we watch these pictures, the live picture of the plane bringing these Americans home, you have to think about the families who have been afraid that they may never see their loved ones again. I want to bring in White House correspondent for the Associated Press, Zeke Miller. Zeke, can you tell us, have we heard anything from the White House?
We have not heard anything from the White House, and I would not expect to hear anything from them until these Americans are wheels up back to the United States. That's something that we've seen in other reported prisoner swaps that have taken place under multiple administrations. They are very tight-lipped until the moment where they are in U.S. custody and out of Russian custody and on their way safely back to their families.
Now, this is all happening at such a critical time in American politics. We're less than 100 days away from an election. President Biden just a short time ago made the decision to not run for re-election. How big a deal is this for the Biden administration?
I mean, this has been one of the major foreign policy priorities of the president. In the case of Paul Whelan, for pretty much his entire administration, and Evan Gershkovich the last year and change since his detention. So this has certainly been very high on the list for President Biden and his administration. And it was one of the things that he mentioned as something that he wanted to get done in his final 6 months in office, in that Oval Office address just a little over a week ago. So being able to potentially bring it, show a deliverable on one of his top priorities for the end of his time of his one and only term in office is certainly a feather in the cap for the president's foreign policy legacy that he's trying to show the American people in his closing days, with less than 6 months left before he leaves the White House.
Zeke, I know the families of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich have been trying desperately to keep their loved ones in the national spotlight and put pressure on the White House. Have you heard, has the White House been having conversations with the Whelan family, the Gershkovich family? Has there been a lot of pressure to make this happen?
There's certainly been ongoing conversations between the White House, the State Department, other U.S. government officials, and the Whelan Gershkovich families, the families of all detained Americans, not just in Russia, but in other countries as well. That's been a priority of the Biden administration. It was also a priority of the Trump administration to sort of keep an open line of communication with the families, making them feel seen, making them feel heard. In different contexts, we've seen that from the White House, the Biden administration, with in the case of American citizens who were detained in Hamas captivity in the October 7th attack in Israel. So that has been sort of a hallmark of how the U.S. government, over the last decade, has approached the issue of wrongfully detained or American hostages held anywhere as a transparent, ongoing conversations with the families. And certainly, if this deal is concluded, we'll certainly hear a lot more about the depth and duration and the cadence of those conversations.
Again, all of this is happening in the midst of our presidential race. Donald Trump has said that if he won the White House again, he would get Evan Gershkovich released on day one. He has been saying that. He has been promising that. The fact that this happened today under the Biden administration, how significant is that?
It certainly does neuter a political message that former President Trump was going to use on the campaign trail, but this is one of those moments that really does transcend politics. This is, the return of Americans held overseas, is sort of foundational to the role of a president of any party. And so you would sort of like to see some sort of bipartisan consensus around doing this. At the same time, it's hard to put blinders on in a political year. Certainly there'll be some sort of politically tinged reaction, particularly as we learn about the other side of that agreement, who had to be traded in order to secure the release of these men. And those are very tough policy calls. And, certainly there may be some things there that some people may criticize. So it'll be very interesting to see how, on one hand, you're talking about the very positive potential release of Americans held wrongfully overseas, but also at what cost and how that will play out in the public space and the political space is something we'll have to follow in the days and weeks ahead.
And we want to mention that we've learned that the families of the released Americans have been invited to the White House. Again, we are seeing live pictures of a plane in Turkey carrying these 3 Americans back home. We're still awaiting details as to the specifics of this deal, but I want to ask Zeke, is there also the concern about backlash? There will certainly be some who criticize the administration for giving Vladimir Putin what he wants. Though 3 Americans are coming home safe, there are some who argue that this gives an incentive for Putin to continue to do this kind of thing.
Now, that really is a question that is asked every time one of these deals are struck. And it's a valid question because there are no clear-cut answers here. Because on one hand, you do incentivize this sort of behavior on the part of Russia, on the part of other American adversaries to take essentially hostages in order to secure the release of their own priorities or their own international agendas. And that's a policy problem. At the same time, there's we've heard this over multiple administrations, what they view as a moral obligation to try to secure the release of Americans. And I think what we'll probably hear, assuming this deal does go all the way through today, which very hopefully does, we'll hear more about that soon. Essentially how this administration has had to weigh those complicated concerns. Nobody's, these are moments where, there's joy that you get these Americans back, but nobody's very happy about having to do this sort of arrangement. It is a very tough policy trade-off.
Well, Zeke Miller, White House correspondent for the Associated Press, thanks so much for joining us. I want to turn now to William Pomeranz. He's the senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. First off, thanks so much for joining us, William. Give us a quick overview. Where do U.S. Russia relations stand right now?
Well, they are in a very difficult position. And it's very encouraging that some of these essentially hostages have been released. But I don't see this as a real turn in U.S.-Russian relations.
How is a deal like this able to be negotiated when tensions are so high between these two countries?
Well, I think it is able to be negotiated because everyone gets something in this exchange. So we're still waiting to see all of the Americans and who they are coming home. But I think that Russia, in the sense, wanted to make a deal. This will be a propaganda coup for them because they have gotten some of their prisoners in the West to the Russian Federation. But I don't think this will have a significant impact on U.S.-Russian relations, especially since the war in Ukraine is ongoing.
William, can you give us a sense of how the Russian court system works? Because we have heard from the U.S. government from the beginning that these Americans did nothing wrong, that they were political prisoners. Can you give us a sense, a little information about the Russian court system, how it works?
Well, the court system is very much biased to the Russian state and the prosecutor's office. And essentially, there is no ability to have a defense for these defendants. So it was a foregone conclusion that they would be convicted. The only positive thing about the conviction is that once they were convicted, the Russians would say they had a fair court system and that they basically indicted and convicted all of the people.
Really powerful moments that we're watching live as the plane sits on the tarmac in Turkey carrying these 3 Americans home. William, if this deal didn't happen, what were these Americans facing? What kind of conditions would they be enduring in a Russian prison?
They would be enduring very harsh conditions. In many cases, no access to families or Western media and so forth. They would be isolated, and it was just a traumatic position for all these Americans who, as you said, did nothing wrong, yet found themselves stuck inside the Russian prison penal system.
Now, we know that several Russian prisoners are being released as part of this exchange. Are there concerns about the concessions that the U.S. had to make in these cases?
We'll have to wait and see who is traded in this swap. Obviously, in the previous swap with Brittany Griner, they swapped a major Russian, basically war criminal and gun runner for Brittany Griner. So we'll have to wait and see as to who is exchanged. But I think that in light of the terrible conditions that these Americans were placed under, I think that a deal will be a positive aspect for this event.
Will Russia and Putin view this as a win as well?
I'm sure he will. He always thinks everything is a win for him. And, you know, Russia has a tradition of no prisoners left behind. And so whoever Russia was able to exchange, I believe that there were some people who had been arrested in Slovakia. But I think Putin will herald this as a win and an attempt to say that Russia was able to get its prisoners and that it made no concessions to the West. Indeed, everyone who was exchanged from the American side had already been convicted.
I want to bring in Olivia Gazis. Olivia, I want to talk about, we have been here before. We've been here with Brittany Griner. We've been here with Trevor Reed. And now we're here with Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan and also Kermashema. Are we going to be back here again? Is Putin going to continue to do this? And is there any sort of warning that the U.S. government puts out for Americans that this could happen to them if they travel to Russia?
I think, Michael, as you've been discussing, there is clearly a benefit that the Russians can see to opportunistically taking Americans on its soil. and accusing them of something either legitimately or not in order to leverage their eventual release. We've seen it happen time and again. And that is why when these cases arise, and this is not to blame the people who go there, but the State Department does stress Russia has a travel advisory in place. It is a level 4. That is the highest level advisory against traveling into the country, precisely because of the dangers that Americans could face if they step foot on a very aggressive adversary's soil. So they try to remind Americans you are not welcome there, you are at risk of being arbitrarily detained there, you are at risk of being imprisoned there. Do not travel. That is hard, of course. There is a robust Russian-American community in the United States. There's plenty of reasons to want to travel for Russia, for reporting, for business, for family relations. So not everybody heeds that warning, but it is a fact that the U.S. government stresses it is dangerous to go there, do not go, and that's why that travel advisory is in existence.
I also want to ask about what's taking place right now. Again, we're still awaiting the details of this deal, but I have to imagine there are many government agencies involved in the transport of these Americans back home.
Absolutely. We do know from previous cases that this ends up being a whole of government undertaking. It's the White House, it's the State Department, it's the CIA. Think about all of the logistics that need to be involved in coordinating families, in determining where is a sort of neutral territory for the swap to take place, coordinating planes to get there, negotiating with prisons, dealing with justice departments. You can see why it is one of the most complex undertakings and politically fraught undertakings that governments can engage in. The pictures, I assume, show that there are multiple planes on the tarmac. We do know this deal is historically complex in how it was constructed, and we do know that it was a months-long endeavor, and in the case of Paul Whelan, a years-long endeavor by the U.S. government to deal with the Russians, to find the key that would unlock a deal in order to secure the release of the Americans who had been deemed wrongfully detained and that the U.S. wanted to have back.
What was the interest for the U.S. in getting these prisoners home safe, and what international concerns arise when Americans are imprisoned abroad?
Well, I mean, the safety of American citizens, you will hear the U.S. government say, is its paramount interest, right? The U.S. is going to protect whoever it is, wherever it is. It's going to endeavor to bring them home to safety and to their families, especially in cases where these people are arbitrarily detained by a hostile foreign government. We know that Russia is not the only one who does this. There are dozens of other Americans being held overseas in places like China, Venezuela, Iran. And in every case, there is an intensive process that the U.S. government undertakes in order to determine whether these individuals can be released. It becomes more fraught when they have dual citizenship. As we've been discussing, some of the prisoners that Russia has taken have dual American and Russian citizenship, in which case the Russians can claim we are treating this person as a Russian and not as an American citizen. China has done so as well when there have been joint Chinese and American citizens detained on Chinese soil. The Chinese will say we are detaining one of our own citizens and therefore we do not even have to offer consular access to you. And so that is why this process that we've been talking about of designating somebody wrongfully detained is laborious, requires a lot of lawyers and investigation and dealing with a foreign government in order to say there is actually no there and we need the citizen back.
I want to turn now to AP White House correspondent Zeke Miller. Zeke, I want to talk about the vice president. I imagine that she will also be at the White House when these Americans arrive home. But how significant is this for her campaign? Will this be something that we see her bring up as she runs for the White House?
Yeah, she's currently in Houston this morning to attend a memorial service for Sheila Jackson Lee, but her schedule has her returning to Washington. So presumably she'd want to be involved in whatever sort of welcome there is here back in the United States. She's a member of the Biden administration, and she, she's running on the Biden-Harris administration record, and this is about to be yet another policy success that she would be able to point to. So it would, I think it's certainly safe to say she's going to, talk about that in the days and weeks ahead. At the same time, this is not one of those issues that is that moves a ton of votes, but is a sort of thing that can help show competence and the capability to lead the country that she will try to sort of associate herself with as she tries in the next 96 days to make her case to the American people that she should be in the Oval Office.
William Pomeranz, senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. We were talking about U.S. Russia relations, and one thing that strikes me is that Russian politics, the Putin administration has been indelibly tied to American politics over the last few years, and there is a perception that that Putin certainly favors former President Trump winning the White House again. Is it surprising at all that Putin was willing to release these Americans under the Biden administration?
Yes, I think that is surprising in a variety of ways. But I think obviously Russia wanted to make this deal as well. I think it helps Putin's position. I think he would have wanted to wait a little while and maybe get some glory to former President Trump. But I think the pressure, essentially, on world opinion to get some of these people released was a drag on Russia. Again, not that they don't have other problems, serious problems as well, but now this one problem is off the table.
What is the role of Turkey as sort of the stopping point for this prisoner swap?
I think Turkey has tried to play an intermediary role throughout this war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. And so Turkey will gain some prestige by being able to pull off this prisoner swap. And I think Erdogan will use this to try to promote Turkey as an intermediary for some sort of peace deal. I don't know if Erdogan really has the respect of the Ukrainians to do that, but I think he will try to use it as making and establishing Turkey as the peacemaker. And there are lots of attempts to have peace negotiations, and I think this will basically help Erdogan and Turkey to play that role.
William Pomeranz, Olivia Gazis, Zeke Miller, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Again, 3 Americans facing the possibility of years in a Russian prison, now headed home. We'll be back shortly with more.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now. We got something crazy.
And reach for the stars.
Here we are. Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
For 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Don't miss true crime anytime you want, anywhere you go. With the 48 Hours podcast. Real crimes, real lives, real justice.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Listen to 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Imagine yourself in Manhattan with no police, no army, no mayor.
The people of Haiti stare down poverty, corruption, natural disasters, and violence.
90% of the guns that are used by gangs in Haiti are American guns.
but with an unbreakable spirit and eternal optimism.
There are days where I cry, but we can't be discouraged. We still believe in Haiti.
They're still able to look ahead with hope.
Haiti is on the brink of transformation, a radical shift. Nations are coming together and saying things must change.
Fighting for Haiti, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's going to be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today. I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was going to be born, he was only going to live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone.
This could happen to anybody.
And sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
I'm John Dickerson. Join me for the Daily Report, weekdays on CBS News 24/7.
Okay, let's go. You guys good?
Hey.
All right, we good?
Keep going. The clock, it's ticking.
Off we go.
60 minutes. 60 minutes.
60 minutes.
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sundays on CBS.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Reiser in for Vladimir Duthier. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News learning that Paul Whelan, an American who has been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prisoner swap. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department have consistently said the charges were false. The United States says Whelan was also wrongfully detained. Right now, we're looking at a live shot here out of Ankara, Turkey. We're seeing planes there on the tarmac. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins me now. Nancy, they're believed to be on board those planes, but we have to remind people that all this is taking place hush-hush, behind closed doors diplomacy. Remind us who Gershkovich, Whelan, and a third journalist are, and who else is part of this swap.
We understand it's a very complicated swap, so it's fascinating to see them see those planes on the ground in Ankara. But it's also possible that this could be taking place at multiple sites involving multiple prisoners. We just simply don't have all the details yet, Lindsay. As for the Americans who are involved, you're right. There are 3 of them. Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was taken into custody last year, accused of espionage, which the U.S. government has always denied. And then there's Paul Whelan. He is a former U.S. Marine. He was taken into custody nearly 6 years ago, also accused of espionage, also sentenced to 16 years. He has been in Russian penal colonies ever since. And then the third American you mentioned is Alsu Kurmasheva. She is a Russian-American radio reporter who was also taken into custody last year. So our understanding is that all 3 of them will be coming home. We don't have the details we can share yet about any Russians who might be headed back to Russia in exchange, either from U.S. prisons or from other prisons around the world. I can tell you that it caught the eye of reporters yesterday when we started to notice that some Russian detainees were being removed from U.S. prisons. Their names were disappearing from the system. And reportedly, the Americans were leaving their Russian prisons and penal colonies as well. And that was one of the first indications that something was going down after many months of on and off negotiations.
You say many months. Have we learned anything about how this was coordinated? You are oftentimes in the White House press briefing room. We know that members of the media have been asking questions, but we're talking about, for example, in Whelan's case, 5.5 years. And so certainly, while maybe this isn't top pressing news every single day in that briefing room, important to note that things do happen behind the scenes.
I mean, this has really been an agonizing wait for the Whelan family because they've watched several other prisoner swaps take place over the years that looked like they might involve Paul, and then he was left behind. Trevor Reed was released. He was actually taken into custody after Paul, and he was released first, partly because Reed was in bad health, and U.S. officials were very concerned about him and his condition. Then you had Brittany Griner, who was taken into custody years after Paul Whelan, the basketball star. She was sent back to the U.S. in a prisoner swap last year. For whatever reason, the Russians have resisted handing Whelan over. And so these talks have been taking place. We do ask about them periodically in the White House briefing. Obviously, U.S. officials are generally reluctant to give us any kind of update, anything that might influence the negotiations. Sometimes there's a message that they want to get across to the Russians publicly. I can remember one time several months ago when suddenly, I believe it was John Kirby said, "We haven't heard from the Russians for months. We've been trying to contact them, but they've gone radio silent." And that was an unusual detail we're not used to getting. And I was told later that, you know, it was sort of a last-ditch attempt to get the Russians to re-engage because they simply weren't taking part in the negotiations.
Nancy, stand by for us. I want to bring in CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. So, Olivia, what do we know about the process of getting these Americans home?
Well, Lindsay, I mean, this has been described to me as one of the most complex negotiations in the history of U.S. Russia and even U.S. Soviet relations, when we, of course, knew that spies were being routinely swapped between the two countries. But the reason that this case is different is the number of players involved and the type of prisoners involved. These are not just spies. These are what we know America has deemed political prisoners in the case of Evan and Paul and Alsu, all of whom we expect to step foot on American soil later tonight. As Nancy mentioned, speculation had been mounting as the names of some prominent Russian political dissidents had disappeared from the prison rosters where they were being held. Paul Whelan's whereabouts were suddenly not known. A prominent Kremlin critic, Vladimir Karamurza, suddenly disappeared. His lawyers didn't know where he was. So there was speculation growing in recent days that something was afoot. But as you have been discussing, there are a number of U.S. government agencies that are involved in these negotiations. The White House, the State Department, the CIA in previous negotiations has been the key channel through which the Russians prefer to deal with us. And as we await further details as to who was instrumental, we do know that some families are going to be very happily reunited in a matter of hours.
And when we talk about how complex this is, I mean, part of the reason is because of all the countries involved. What can you tell us about the prisoners Russia is getting in return? I know one of them shot a former separatist fighter in broad daylight outside a Berlin park. He was in custody in Germany.
That's right. We know from public reporting that the Russians had their eye on Vadim Krasikov, who is, yes, as you mentioned, a convicted murderer who is serving a life sentence in Germany for the assassination of a German citizen who fought against the Russian forces in Chechnya. He has been there for years, and the Russians have had their eyes on him. But that meant that he was not in U.S. custody, right? He was not the Americans to trade. And so we're still waiting for details as to whether he is in fact part of this trade. There's been plenty of speculation that he is, because up until this point, the Russians, as Nancy mentioned, had been reluctant to engage in any deal that the U.S. had put on the table. And we do know from U.S. officials that, as they characterize them, significant deals had been put on the table in December and over the course of the spring.
Olivia, it has been nearly 2 weeks since Gershkovich was sentenced. Why is it believed that negotiations couldn't really begin in earnest until that happened?
That's more of the Russian process than it is the U.S. process. The Russians sort of need to do their bureaucratic paperwork. And usually as part of this, President Putin needs to officially pardon the people that he is letting out of his country. We're still seeing whether that entire process has played out. But yes, speculation, in fact, did start in early July when what was viewed as a very hurried process played out for Evan Gershkovich. people who follow this closely were saying that is a box that the Russians need to check before they let somebody go. And on the same day that his trial was running, in a secret trial, Alsu Kurmasheva was also being sentenced to 6.5 years in a Russian prison. So this was all very hurried in early July and may have been part of the groundwork that was being laid in these sensitive diplomatic and intelligence talks.
Olivia, stay with us as well. I want to bring in CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. Liz, you've been in court with Paul Whelan in the past. What can you say about the gravity of this moment?
Well, Paul Whelan has been in custody longer than any of the other prisoners being released today. His family kept the case front and center. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow was exceptionally good in continuing to visit him. But we know that he has felt forgotten, and certainly during the COVID years, it was difficult to see him, and he would have felt very isolated. He was passed over several times. For example, when Greiner was released, everybody hoped that, or at least his family hoped that he would be released too, and it didn't happen. So today will be a huge relief for all the people, especially his brother, who've been advocating for this all this time.
You know, we had mentioned Vadim Krasakov, one of the imprisoned Russians imprisoned in Germany, that Putin was interested in getting back as part of this swap. Sort of reminds me of Victor Bout, the notorious arms dealer who was swapped for Greiner in that swap that happened. What does this tell you about why Putin and Russia want these dangerous loyalists back so badly?
Krasakov was an FSB agent, so he was an intelligence officer. And President Putin has to shore up the support of the intelligence community. That's his main constituent, like one of the pillars of his power base, and also the military. And so he makes a big deal out of getting back agents that have been taken into what he would consider enemy hands. And it's all part of the code of loyalty, showing that he is on the side of his security forces. And this will be a big part of that, and in fact will play very well in Russia, showing that the president always sticks up for his men.
Elizabeth Palmer, thank you so much. Let's bring back CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, do we expect to hear from President Biden or see him today?
I anticipate we will hear from him, Lindsay, as soon as it is confirmed that the entire prisoner swap has taken place successfully and that the Americans are safely on their way back to U.S. soil. Prior to that, the president, other U.S. officials are generally very reluctant to say anything. They don't want to do anything to anger the Russians, to jeopardize these very sensitive negotiations. So they tend to stay mum. We're not getting, any public reaction so far at all from U.S. officials for the most part, aside from confirming that this is imminent. But absolutely, as someone who has made the return of U.S. political prisoners around the world a major priority, I anticipate that President Biden will have something to say in public later today. And I'm sure he'll also want to see these Americans once they are safely back on U.S. soil and in good health, because he has met periodically with their families over the years, and he has talked about how badly he wants to bring them home. So this is no doubt a great day for him if everything goes as planned.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
For more on this, let's bring in William Pomerantz. He's the senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. First, sir, thanks for being with us. Give us your read on this.
Well, it is a piece of very good news for all of the families of the detained prisoners. So I was not expecting this deal to really be done, but it has happened, and it will be a great day when all the Americans come back to U.S. soil.
Why was this not something you were expecting? Why is this a surprise?
It was a surprise because I thought that Putin would want to kind of extend these negotiations as long as possible, so that he wants to be relevant. And this was one way, a very difficult way to be relevant as well. So I didn't think that he was going to make a deal, and I didn't think that he had a lot of pressure to make a deal. But clearly, as one of your other commentators mentioned, there are several people who were in the security services, and Putin wanted to get them out through any means. So I think this will be a positive development for Putin, although it doesn't mean that U.S.-Russian relations will be on a positive footing for a long time to come.
Do you think that Putin takes American politics into account when making these deals and making these, because while there might be some concerns, certainly the Biden administration is going to try and express to the American people that this is a win in their view?
I don't think, quite frankly, Putin understands American politics in the larger sense of the word. And so he has made so many mistakes over the last 2.5 years that I don't think he really has a clear understanding of the political situation in the United States. If he believes that somehow this helps him politically, I don't think it will. I think that the United States and its European allies have basically said that they want to hold Putin accountable for this terrible war in Ukraine. And I don't think a prisoner swap changes that position.
Of course, we've been talking about Korsakoff. I mentioned Viktor Bout. These are some of the people that Putin wanted to get out of prison and back home to show that he is loyal to them, that they're loyal to him. Are there concerns about the concessions that the U.S. had to make in these cases?
There always are concerns. And the major concern is that once these prisoners are released, that Putin will just continue to find Americans or find Americans who are on Russian soil and will do the same thing. So there is the fear that this only engages Putin and he will do this again because he gets a deal. So that is a real concern going forward.
All right, William Pomerantz, thank you so much. Appreciate your time and your expertise. Let's go back to Olivia Gazis. Olivia, any developments since we last spoke to you just a few minutes ago? I know this is a rapidly evolving situation.
Sure. I think we are still waiting for all of the Americans to be wheels up from that tarmac in Ankara. And when they do, we will hear more details about how this all came to pass. But as you were just discussing there, I do think it's worth noting that the U.S. government knows there is a cost to making these trades, right? They have a justice system that has put resources towards convicting these criminals who have committed crimes and are detained in American detention systems. That is part of the reason why the State Department in particular likes to remind Americans not to give the Russians fodder, as it will. They have Russia at a level 4 travel advisory, meaning do not travel to that country. It is an adversarial country. When you are there, you are at risk of being arbitrarily detained, and it is not clear that the U.S. government can do anything to help you. As we have seen in the cases of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, they had to go through a special process within the State Department in which they were determined wrongfully detained, because it can be the case that an American citizen goes and does actually commit an infraction or break a law and are legitimately imprisoned by a foreign government. In their case, the U.S. government went through its process and determined in neither case were they actually committing any of the crimes that they were accused of. And of course, the Russians in both of their cases accused them of espionage. In Alsu Kurmasheva's case, her case was still going through that deliberative process. She had not officially been determined to have been wrongfully detained, but President Biden personally called for her by name to be released in April at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which shed additional light on her case, and from its trappings looked as though she, like Evan Gershkovich, was a journalist on Russian soil.
And of course, on the flip side of those concerns, we have the families of Gershkovich and Whelan. I know we've heard from Gershkovich's parents. We've heard from Whelan's brother, who have both been making this plea for them to return home. And I know that they've been in communication with U.S. officials, right, Olivia?
Absolutely. The families here are the ones where your heart really goes out the most, and especially in the case of somebody like Paul Whelan, who, as you've been discussing, did get passed over effectively in 2 additional negotiations that resulted in the release of Trevor Reed before him and Brittany Griner before him. So he's been the longest held American in Russian detention, and his family has been doing its best to keep his case in the media. His brother reaches out to journalists all of the time to provide an update on his case, to say Paul has written us to say he was beaten today or he got an orange today, to provide details that humanize the experience that he is having in a very severe Russian penal colony. His sister Elizabeth has been very active engaging U.S. government officials traveling to Washington, D.C. to get in people's faces and make an effort to actually effort change in his case. In the same way, the Wall Street Journal obviously has unspooled a great campaign in order to keep Evan's case in the news. Hashtag slogan, journalism is not a crime. They know that the more attention these cases get, the more likely it is that pressure mounts on a given administration to actually fight for these people's release.
All right, Olivia Gazis, thank you so much. We are continuing to follow the latest on this major prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S., and our coverage continues right after this break. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm, it's a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
Welcome back. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News is learning that Paul Whelan, an American who has been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prisoner swap. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department have consistently said the charges are false. The United States says Whelan was also wrongfully detained. For more on this, I'm joined by John Sullivan. He was U.S. Ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022 and is now a CBS News contributor. Ambassador, thanks for being with us. What is your reaction?
Well, first, I'm delighted for the Americans who've been released and their families. I was in my office at the State Department almost 6 years ago when Paul was set up by the FSB and arrested. I've been thinking about Paul, working on his case, talking to his family for a long time, and I know that his brothers, his sister, his parents are going to be overjoyed. Evan was arrested after I had left Moscow as ambassador, but I know that his family will feel the same way, and the other American who has been released, Aslu, her family will be overjoyed. I've spoken to all of them since I've left Moscow, so I have a feeling of elation for those Americans who've been released and their families, but I also know that there's a price that the United States and some of our allies, apparently Germany, have paid in releasing Russian dangerous criminals to get innocent Americans back home.
You know, you were mentioning Paul Whelan, and we heard from him last December, his 5th Christmas behind bars, and he was saying that he felt left behind because he was not included in the prisoner swap that included basketball star Brittany Griner. What do you know about why he wasn't included in previous prisoner swaps?
Well, from my conversations with the Russians, and I was engaged in a lot of negotiations with the Russians over Paul, some of it was about his release, other negotiations were just about how badly he was being treated and to have that stop. But what the Russians would point to was the fact that they would characterize him as an American spy. They would say he's been convicted of espionage, and we don't trade spies for just any ordinary criminal. We want a like-for-like exchange. And they thought at that time that there wasn't someone in U.S. custody who would be an equivalent to be traded for Paul. We in the United States knew, of course, that was completely bogus, that Paul was set up. He's not an American spy. He doesn't work for U.S. intelligence agencies. But that was the Russian position.
What can you tell us about the Russian judicial system and how these trials went?
So I was an observer of Trevor Reed's trial, who is an American who was wrongfully detained, who was released while I was ambassador in 2022. I was frequently in the courtroom during his court proceedings. I was not allowed into Paul's trial because it was a secret trial with secret evidence that some of which even Paul didn't get to see. So the way I'd characterize the Russian judicial system is, it's to borrow a Russian cultural reference, it's a Potemkin judicial system. It's fake. It's phony. The courtrooms are beautiful. The judges wear beautiful robes with a gold chain that cinches the robe at the top. But it is completely a non-adversarial system. It's merely a means for the Russian government to justify what it's doing to an American who's been charged, in Paul's case, with espionage. It's not what an American lawyer, which I am, would think of as a court.
Appreciate you, Ambassador. Thank you for being with us. Let's bring back CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer. Liz, it's important to note, as important as this prisoner swap is and significant, there are still many Americans who have not been released and are not part of this deal.
That's right. I've just counted them up. There are 7 Americans that remain in U.S. custody. And the distinction that the ambassador made there is crucial. So the majority of them are in jail for crimes, nothing to do with the security establishment, and as far as we can tell, not trumped-up charges either, although the details aren't clear in every case. But, for example, 2 of them were arrested on drugs charges, possession. One man is involved in a child custody dispute with a Russian wife. One has been arrested for theft and beating up his girlfriend, and one for being completely blind drunk on a train and attacking a policeman. The one exception is Ksenia Karolina from L.A. She was picked up in Russia this spring and has been charged with treason, which carries a sentence of 20 years, allegedly for having given money that reached Ukrainian military. It's not clear what's going to happen with her, but we do know for sure she wasn't included in this prisoner exchange, and that will have been devastating for her family.
Liz, we have been talking a little bit about Gershkovich and Whelan. There are two other people as part of this. There's also Kermashev. She's a U.S. dual nationalist. There's also Vladimir Kara-Murza. He's a prisoner held in Russia. What can you tell us about these two?
He is a very brave guy. He is a human rights activist and sometimes politician. He ran to be a parliamentarian in Russia. But he was a strong opposition of President Putin. He also worked for one of the leading exiled opposition figures, the former chess champion. I'm blanking. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, Khodorkovsky. And so, as such, he really identified himself, made himself very prominent as an opponent of the Russian government. And he was arrested, charged with treason, and has been in jail ever since. Although he's a British citizen, Cambridge educated, he has really strong ties to the United States. He worked on human rights cases with the late Senator McCain, and Senator McCain emailed him shortly before his death and asked him if he would be one of the pallbearers at the senator's funeral. He also continued to write very critical political commentary from inside jail and won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for those writings. It will be inexpressibly wonderful for his family to know he's getting out, because he believes he was poisoned twice by the Russian security services. His health has been fragile, and he hasn't been getting the care in jail that he has needed. So now he'll be back in safe hands.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us again. Appreciate it. We have been covering this major breaking news. You're seeing on your screen right now a plane on a tarmac there in Turkey. There is a big prisoner swap underway currently, and exact movements and whereabouts of the prisoners that we have been mentioning aren't exactly clear to us right now. We're working to gather more information on that. But some names that you have been hearing, Evan Gershkovich, Paul Whelan, they're part of the prisoner swap. As well as being swapped for a Putin ally who is jailed in Germany and convicted of murder there. For more reaction from Capitol Hill, let's go to congressional correspondent Scott McFarland. Scott, what are you hearing?
Well, there is this dual political message that's beginning to emanate as the morning concludes here in Washington, Lindsay. There are Republicans, including the House Republican chair, Elise Stefanik, criticizing the nature of any agreement that releases dangerous Russians as part of an agreement. And Michael McCall, who is the top Republican on the Foreign Affairs panel here in the U.S. House, has also said, while grateful for the return of these heroic Americans, there is concern that there is an exchange that could incentivize future hostage taking. I expect to hear a lot more of that on the campaign trail as J.D. Vance and former President Trump make their arguments today, and among House and Senate Republicans as they make their arguments through the day here at the Capitol. As for the president's supporters in Congress, they are championing what they would say is not only the release of Americans who long ago should have been released, but by the stewardship of the administration to get this done now.
Do you expect that the concern and applause will be divided along party lines with this issue, Scott?
I sure do. I think this is one of those things that, though in a more fundamental dynamic, it transcends politics. Everybody is grateful for their safe return. This in no way is going to transcend politics when it comes to the machinations used to secure their release. This will be a campaign issue that is wielded, no doubt, by Republicans arguing too high a price had to be paid to get these hostages back. But take a look at the statement from Philadelphia Congressman Brendan Boyle there on the screen. That their unjust imprisonment as hostages is yet another sobering reminder of how evil the Putin regime really is. There is a synchronization, Lindsay, among both parties that the Putin regime is, in fact, evil. And there's another statement. Haley Stevens is a Democrat from suburban Detroit saying, your family have been tireless advocates, and we cannot wait to see you reunited. reunited. So you have that. You have Democrats championing the president for his stewardship. You'll have Republicans saying that these types of negotiations may trigger more hostage taking in the future. You can't suck out the politics from all of this, even though there, of course, is unanimity in the expressive relief that these hostages are coming back home.
You said unity in expressive relief. Have the families of Evan Gershkovich or Paul Whelan met with Congress? Have they spoken in front of Congress before?
Yeah, the supporters of these families and these families themselves have been actively vocalizing their hopes, their aspirations with Congress. And there are congressional panels that have gotten into this, had their own investigations, had their own hearings. But this is a unilateral move, really, to a degree, of the executive branch. This is the president and the president's team leading this effort. Congress can offer its opinions, can offer funding to help support protective efforts, but this really is the administration's world. Congress, though, is certainly going to give their opinions as the day continues.
Scott McFarland, thank you so much. And we continue to follow the latest on this prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S. Our coverage continues right on the other side of this break. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
Nate has one of the quickest minds I've ever seen.
Tony has a way of making people feel comfortable.
Gail has this unbelievable knack to ask the question that you're asking at home.
I've been told I could talk to a tree, and that's pretty much true.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
It didn't seem like anything could happen, because nothing ever happens in East Palestine, but it did.
Authorities released toxic fumes from 5 derailed train cars.
Resident, please evacuate.
Acute bronchitis due to chemical fumes.
Did you ever have these problems before the derailment?
No, ma'am.
This neighborhood's not safe no more.
We can assure the community that there's not vinyl chloride entering their communities.
Then why are there so many people feeling these various symptoms of bloody noses or difficulty breathing, bronchitis?
That's a hard question to answer.
We're talking about one of the most blatant releases of a mixture of some of the most toxic chemicals that we've seen in America.
I feel like now I have a duty to warn other communities. If my daughter has to watch me die of cancer, at least it saves someone else.
This case.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
But it's not fiction. It's 48 hours.
Human remains found this week.
4 families shattered.
There's no physical evidence.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Like a John Grisham novel.
A gripping true crime original. 48 hours. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Stories that inform.
Or you can be really old at 60, and you can be really young at 85.
Inspire.
How do we unlock the power within ourselves to be who we want to be?
And brighten your day.
The best part of fame is making people feel good. Always send the people home happy.
Make every day a little more like Sunday morning.
Here comes the sun.
Stream now on the free CBS News app.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Dragon capsule here in space.
Sightseers in space, the thrill of a lifetime.
Seeing the Earth from space, it was so exhilarating.
But the risks that come with the territory.
There have been 4 fatal accidents. That's a 1% fatal accident rate.
Might make you look before you launch.
If you had 1 out of 100 airplanes falling out of the sky, we'd have a public crisis.
Space tourism, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Welcome back, everybody. We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News learning that Paul Whelan, an American who had been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prisoner swap. Gershkovich, the Journal, and the State Department have consistently said the charges are false and he had a sham trial. The United States says Whelan has been wrongfully detained for nearly 6 years. CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis joins us now. Olivia, for anyone just joining us, give us some of the top lines of what we know right now.
Sure, Lindsay. Well, U.S. officials who have been intimately involved in this months-long negotiation process have described it to me as the most complex in U.S. Russian history and even U.S. Soviet history, which, as we know, the spy swaps at that time were legion. This one outdoes that one, any of those, because of how many players are involved and the types of prisoners that have been involved. These are not strictly spies that we're talking about. We are talking about political prisoners, and their cases are necessarily more fraught in negotiation. The Russians can be more capricious in who they hold for what reason, and that's one of the reasons why this case has officials expressing just how difficult it was to get over the finish line. Speculation had been mounting over the course of this week that some kind of a deal was afoot. Russian prisoners started disappearing off of their prison rosters. Prominent political dissidents, suddenly their whereabouts were unknown. Among them, among the prisoners whose names started disappearing were Paul Whelan and Vladimir Kara-Murza, a prominent Kremlin critic who we understand may be part of these negotiations as well. So we're waiting for the full details on what Russia is receiving in exchange. But what we do know is that 3 American citizens are set to set foot on American soil, hopefully in a matter of hours.
Olivia, do we know who in the administration and U.S. government has been taking the lead on these negotiations? And what have we reported in the past on negotiations and sort of the steps that led us here?
Sure. Well, we know that in the past this has involved a whole of government undertaking. So the White House, the State Department, and when it comes to the Russians, usually the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, are going to be involved. And that's what we understand to have been the case here. So that is multiple agencies handling multiple parts of this negotiation, the diplomacy of it, the deals that ultimately needed to be struck, the logistics of where these prisoners might actually wind up being physically escorted to their respective modes of transportation. We also needed to understand what the Russians would ultimately agree with in order to free the Americans they were holding. They had been resistant to any deals that had been put on the table in the past, and U.S. officials have made clear that they believe they were putting significant offers on the table that the Russians had repeatedly rebuffed.
Olivia Gazis, thank you. I want to bring back William Pomerantz. He's a senior fellow and former director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. What do we know about what will happen in the coming hours? If anything, this appears to be very secretive for good reason.
Well, we just have to make sure that all the people who are in this swap actually get on the plane and get sent to the United States and to their families. So it is a long process. For those of us who remember the Cold War, it was a very tricky process, and it always involved transitions and exchanges that took place mainly in East Germany. So I think that we're just waiting to see how the swap takes place, who is going to be involved in the swap, and what is the aftermath of the swap. I do not expect that it will be improved U.S.-Russian relations because of all the things that Vladimir Putin has done, both in the Ukraine and basically arresting and using these prisoners as hostages.
You have written extensively about the rule of law in Russia. What can you tell us about their judicial system and the trials for Gershkovich and Whelan, which the U.S. claim are sham trials?
Well, they are sham trials, and Russia has essentially a 99% conviction rate for criminal offenses. So it was inevitable that these people would be convicted. They aren't able to put up a defense. They are not able to see a lot of the evidence. So it was not a fair and open process. And that is a tendency that has long predated these cases, both in the Soviet Union and in the Russian Empire.
William, thank you. I want to bring back John Sullivan. He was U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2020 to 2022. He is now a CBS News contributor. Ambassador, do I have you?
Yes, you do. Good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us again. I want to ask you about the other countries that are involved in this, particularly Germany. We know that one dangerous prisoner that Putin wanted back was in jail, convicted of murder in Germany. What would Germany have to gain by agreeing to cooperate in this with the United States?
Well, yes, this is a big deal for the German government. When I was U.S. ambassador to Russia, I developed a very close relationship with the German ambassador, and we talked a lot about this case. This fellow, Krasakov, he's a colonel in the FSB, which is the principal successor to the KGB. He was sent by the Russian government to commit murder in a park in Berlin. He shot a Russian dissident to death on the orders of the Kremlin, and he's a colonel in the FSB. This was a state-ordered assassination on German territory. It greatly upset Chancellor Merkel and her government, and the KGB officer was given a life sentence. And now, for the Germans to release this individual, it's a very, very significant thing. My expectation is that there may be other Germans. For example, I understand there's a German who maybe have been detained in Belarus and actually given a death sentence, who may be released by the Belarusian government, which is just an indication of why this is such a complex deal. If it turns out to be what we're hearing through the grapevine, it would involve, for example, releasing detainees from potentially another country.
Will Krasakov return to Russia a hero? And maybe history can be our guide. Did Victor Bout, the notorious arms dealer who was released as part of the Brittany Griner swap, return to Russia as a hero?
I am confident in predicting he will not only return as a hero, he will be celebrated, at least in private, by President Putin himself. Putin is a Chekist, a KGB officer for decades. He's famously said there's no such thing as a former KGB man. This guy Krasakov is one of Putin's fellow Chekists. He will be welcomed back as a hero, including by the president of the Russian Federation, which just goes to show what the state of U.S. Russia relations is. Putin believes, to his core, that Russia is at war with the United States and the West. And the way he would view these exchanges, these are like prisoner of war exchanges during wartime. This is not the case of there's a potential for U.S.-Russia relations to improve. As my friend Will Pomeranz said a little while ago, this is just a step in a very fraught relationship, and I don't expect U.S.-Russia relations to improve.
We're looking right now on the ground in Turkey at a shot that our camera has of a tarmac there. Possible that one of the prisoners are on board one of these planes. Of course, this is being done behind closed doors, out of view, for a reason. This is sensitive. This is complex. And I want to ask you how significant it is that a country like Turkey is a part of this.
Well, it is significant, and again, increases the complexity of the deal. It was complex when we did a one-for-one trade back in the spring of 2022, when Trevor Reed was traded for Konstantin Yaroshenko, who was convicted in the United States of a major narcotics trafficking conspiracy. That trade occurred in Ankara. I expect at the same airport, maybe even in exactly the same location. The Turkish government was involved, and a one-for-one trade like that was a very complex undertaking. What we're witnessing today is far more complex, but we do have the muscle memory for doing this type of trade in Turkey, in Ankara, because that's where Trevor Reed was recovered by the United States.
Ambassador, thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
We are continuing to follow the latest on this prisoner swap between Russia and the U.S. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
Washington is the seat of power. National security, foreign policy, global economics, every story comes through Washington in some way. We bring some of the most powerful voices in America to the table. We don't just ask the questions, you have to go deeper. We try to understand what's at the heart of the issue we're talking about, to then come forward with solutions.
Face the Nation on CBS.
The justices ruled that Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution.
In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, uncertainty sets in for some students of color.
Affirmative action really gave us an equal opportunity.
CBS Reports explores the historic decision and what it means for those chasing an opportunity to change their lives.
I knew that college was the ticket to break this cycle.
The end of affirmative action, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
America Decides is your place for fact-based, unbiased reporting.
At the White House, at the Capitol, on the campaign trail.
What do you say to those in your party? Any cracks in the Republican Party?
Our reporters and our anchors travel the country talking to voters like you
about the issues that matter most.
Immigration is really a factor right now
that are going to be driving your decisions.
What would you say to those who say, look, that's just democracy at work?
Listening to you and bringing your voice into our coverage.
I want a strong, proud America.
Is democracy on the ballot in 2024?
Let us help you decide.
America Decides on CBS News 24/7.
Stream our expanded one-hour program Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
It can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable.
The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We are about to see American weapons in the hands of Mexican cartels.
A gun pipeline to Mexico.
We are arming the cartels.
100%, no doubt about it.
Happening right under our noses.
Who's doing something about this? Nobody.
A CBS Reports exclusive.
Most Americans have no idea that we are effectively arming the enemy next door.
This is the story the American people need to know.
Arming cartels, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We continue to follow breaking news. CBS News is learning that Paul Whelan, an American who has been imprisoned in Russia for nearly 6 years, and Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who was just sentenced by Russia to 16 years in a maximum security prison, are both part of a prison swap. Right now, you are looking at images of a tarmac in Turkey, one of the countries believed to be part of this as this rapidly unfolds, and we work to gather more information. Our partners at the BBC are following this also. Let's go ahead and listen in.
We still don't have that full confirmation from the State Department or the White House of the names yet. But I think we can safely say if they end up being the ones that people expect, particularly Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich, we'll be able to see a moment where obviously President Biden meets them very, very soon after they make it back onto US soil. This will be a huge political win for him personally. By extension, for Vice President Harris in her bid to become president in November, win November's presidential election. So drama, politics, spying, it's got it all in a sense. But it is a very, very important moment in history, the likes of which hasn't been seen between the West and Washington, the West and Moscow since the Cold War.
And I wonder, Will, what your thoughts are on the question of whether in Moscow there was a consideration that if Donald Trump was to win the presidential election come November, that these exchanges might have been made more difficult?
It's hard to know exactly what the considerations, the political considerations in terms of, what the outcome will be if Donald Trump wins in November or Vice President Harris. I think It's clearly been a long-term goal of the Biden administration to see Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan in particular back on U.S. soil. It's something that President Biden wanted to achieve before he left office, and now he said he's stepping out of the race. You know, he only has a finite amount of time to achieve that. This is, as I said, a big political win for him in that regard. I think they were probably more focused on making that win happen, if you like, before he leaves office than necessarily the ramifications of what it would mean, you know, should President Trump win. Certainly the families, I think, are just focused on making sure it happened as soon as humanly possible. But this is a two-way street. Vladimir Putin is not a leader who would have just caved